welcome back to yet another episode of Ball with Y'all. It's so great to be here with you today on March 9th. Thank you for choosing to spend your morning, your afternoon, your evening with us here today as we discuss a number of topics across the sports landscape. Now, as always, whether you are tuning in from Spotify or Google Podcasts, Apple Podcasts, Radio Public, Breaker, or if you're watching us on YouTube at BWI Productions, we are so glad to have you here today. As always, I encourage you to check us out on Instagram at Ball with Y'all Podcast as well. As I've talked about before, we have a lot of good content on Instagram, and hopefully you've gotten the opportunity to interact with us on more than one platform over the last week or so. So I think this is episode 7 or 8 here in season 2. We are moving along quite well. Of course, it is the month of March, right? And there are a lot of things that come with the month of March. There might be one thing in particular that you might be thinking of as it relates to the month of March. Yes, my friends, it is madness. We are officially only days away from March Madness, officially kicking off in the form of the NCAA tournament. Now, while we won't be getting into the tournament itself here today, we'll reserve that until next week. There is a pretty prominent tournament taking place in Tampa, Florida, actually beginning tonight, involving the SEC. And as we are an SEC show, we'll get into some of that and what you can expect as an SEC fan for the men's basketball tournament, with a spot in the national tournament on the line as well. On top of that, we'll go into some college football news. You haven't really had too much football news as of late. We'll get into some of that when it particularly relates to some rule changes that are being considered, and some that I like, some that I don't like, and how it could affect how your team plays this fall. And lastly, we'll get into what we saw this past Sunday in Las Vegas in the NASCAR Cup Series, and then also who we expect to potentially pull off a win this coming Sunday in Phoenix for the 4th points race of the year in the Cup Series. With that said, let's get into story number 1. So story number 1, like I mentioned, we have a lot of tournaments taking place right now. We are preparing for March Madness to kick off. I think it's a week from today, actually. Next Wednesday, we'll be kicking off March Madness with the first 4, right? And then getting into the round of 64 and so on, and then a round of 32. And this week is incredibly important because, as you know, right, there are a number of conference tournaments taking place across the country right now. Some have already finished. Some are well underway. And then, of course, the SEC and many others are kicking off today. In the form of tonight, I believe we've got Vanderbilt and Georgia, and then Missouri and Ole Miss. 2 great games there. Of course, these are the lower seeds, but they will be kicking off play tonight. This is the first time the tournament has taken place in Tampa, Florida since 2009, the second time only it's ever taken place in Tampa. And then, of course, next year it's going to go back to Nashville until, I think, 2035 or something like that. So this is a big moment for the state of Florida. They get the opportunity to host the SEC tournament, again, with a spot in the national tournament on the line. Now, we know the 4 favorites, right? Auburn has had an incredible year. They went undefeated at home. Tennessee, an incredible year. I believe they also went undefeated at home. Kentucky, incredible year for them. As always, John Calipari has done wonderful things for them, and they are sitting in prime position. And Arkansas, right? They are sitting as the 4 seed right now in the SEC. They get that bye, and they're clicking at the right time. Much like last year, if you recall, when Musselman, I believe, was the head coach for Arkansas, he got that team clicking at the right time, and they had a lot of momentum going into the tournament. Of course, they got upset pretty early on, but this could be a good opportunity for Arkansas and a number of other teams for that matter as well, because as we've talked about, there are a number of teams that have kind of already solidified their spot in the 64-team field that will come out on Sunday. With Auburn, they're in regardless of what happens in the tournament. Tennessee is already in regardless of what happens. Kentucky, Arkansas, we already know they're in. Alabama, their strength of schedule is ridiculous. Of course, they don't necessarily have the best record in the world. They're the 6th seed in the SEC tournament, but they've beaten Gonzaga. They've beaten Baylor. They've beaten a number of high-quality programs that warrant them being in the tournament. So if you are an Alabama Crimson Tide fan, your team will be in the tournament no matter what happens over the next couple of days. And then lastly, LSU. They have taken a lot of momentum over the last few days. They beat Alabama to close their season out this past Saturday, and LSU is in the tournament regardless of what happens come the next few days. Now, anyone outside of those 6 can, in fact, clinch a berth in the NCAA tournament by winning the whole SEC tournament this week. So think of programs like Mississippi State and Texas A&M and even Florida, right? Florida's, I believe they're 19-11. Mississippi State is 17-13. A&M is also 19-11. These are all programs that are kind of on the bubble right now. They're not really certain as to whether they're actually going to get into the 64-team field. Winning this tournament would first off solidify them into the actual tournament itself, but also give them a much needed boost, a much needed confidence boost, and really a morale changer going into the tournament. Because as we know, this tournament and these late season games can really serve as a spark for these teams. I always think of, I believe it was the 18-19 Auburn team that went to the Final Four. And if you recall, they kind of slumped a little bit toward the end of the regular season, ended up winning the SEC tournament, and then took that momentum on to getting into the Final Four, losing against, I want to say, Virginia, if I recall correctly. And the same thing has taken place before with UCLA. They went on a great run last year, and some of their late season success helped prepare them for that. Baylor as well, same idea last season. So what we typically see is that these late season games, these late season tournaments, really set these programs up for success in the NCAA tournament. And so I think of a team like Arkansas, who's incredibly dangerous, who's starting to click at the right time. This could be the opportunity they've been looking for to really establish that momentum, taking them into the NCAA tournament. Now, who do we like? Of course, we know Auburn. They are rightfully at the top. They have been an incredible team all throughout the season. Bruce Pearl has done incredible things for that basketball team. But their side of the bracket is pretty tough. They've got Texas A&M, right, which we've talked about. They're scrappy. They're trying to get into the bracket right now. We've got into the main bracket, the NCAA bracket. We've got LSU, which I mentioned. They're starting to click at the right time. They just beat Alabama, and they are starting to look really good. They gave Arkansas a run for their money. I believe it was on Wednesday of last week as well. So really LSU, they're looking pretty good right now under Will Wade. And lastly, Arkansas, we know, we've talked about before, they have a great deal of momentum. I don't know how they do it every single year, but here they are, once again, in prime position. They could give Auburn a run for their money as well. Like I said, I feel like Arkansas is catching fire at the right time. Now, as far as the Kentucky side of the bracket, I really like Kentucky a lot. I think they've been incredibly impressive. And, we already know what John Calipari can do in very short order with a team like this, right? In the past, he's had teams where they should win a championship and they don't. This team, it could win. I don't necessarily know that it should, but it could. And that's a credit to Calipari and the credit that he's done with these players in short order. And I think he could do a lot of great things here in this tournament and getting into the main tournament bracket next week. But the problem is they're on the same side as Tennessee, and Tennessee is a massive hurdle. Tennessee has been incredibly strong this year. I believe Rick Barnes is their head coach now, and he's done incredible things for them. And honestly, they really could be, and honestly should be, the team that will come out of this tournament, because I don't know what's going to happen with Auburn. I'm not sure how they're going to get past Arkansas and LSU and all those teams. And honestly, in my opinion, it comes down to Kentucky and Tennessee. But then, caveat, right? We've discussed what team I support and so on. Alabama has been great at times this year, and they've been terrible at times this year. They lost to Georgia, who, if you're not familiar, is toward the bottom of the SEC. They lost to Mississippi State. They lost to Texas A&M. I think they lost to Florida too. They've lost a number of really bad teams. And then they've beaten some incredible teams. They've beaten Gonzaga. They've beaten Baylor. They beat three of the Final Four teams from last year's Final Four. It's incredibly difficult to imagine how well they've done with their strength of schedule, with the schedule they had to play, and they still have a pretty decent record and now sitting sixth right now in the SEC tournament. And last I saw, they're actually slotted for a sixth seed berth in the NCAA tournament as well. So regardless of whatever you think about Alabama, they've played games that have gotten them into the tournament, and that to the point where it doesn't really matter what happens over the next few days. But I go back to, it really just depends on what Alabama team you see here. And if the Alabama team that goes out there and shoots 33s and makes 20 of them, then Kentucky might be in trouble pretty early on before they even get to see Tennessee. But of course, I don't want to get too far ahead of myself. I'd be surprised if Alabama even survives Vanderbilt or Georgia. So we'll see how that unfolds. But you never know what Crimson Tide team you're going to get. Now, with all that said, I like Kentucky to win the SEC tournament this year over Arkansas come this Sunday, March 13th. And a week from today, of course, we will be talking about the NCAA tournament. which we'll see the berths come out, all the different seating that'll all come out Sunday night as well. And as always, I encourage you, get ready for me to be wrong about just about everything, because my bracket's usually not all that good anyway. And now that we have this whole show going on, I can promise you I'm going to get even more wrong. So whatever I say, just say the opposite and you might get a perfect bracket. We'll see how that unfolds a week from today. But like I said, I like Kentucky in the SEC tournament over the next few days, finishing up on March 13th this Sunday. On to story number 2. So story number 2, this was a little bit of a headline that I didn't see coming, and I really didn't know what to make of it at first. I really had to look at it for a little bit because I really had to chew on it, if you will, because at first it doesn't seem like it's a whole lot, right? You're starting to see some rumors like, oh, they're thinking about revisiting targeting, and they're thinking about revisiting players faking injuries, and they're thinking about revisiting a number of things. And apparently they're thinking about revisiting the clock rules and how we handle that in college football. So the report came out last week, I believe, that the NCAA Rules Committee is considering 2 clock-related rule changes. Of course, the Rules Committee, if you're not familiar, I believe they meet every 2 years, and they have the opportunity to change whatever rules. So that's why we've seen targeting change so many times since it was first introduced in 2013 or so. A number of rule changes throughout the years. This is another example of that. And ultimately, the goal here is to keep players safe, to cut down on the time of games, and cut down on the time on the number of plays that teams are running, right? And oftentimes you see an Ole Miss, for example, is out there running 100 plus plays sometimes, and they want to avoid that because ultimately speaking, the idea is you cut down the exposure that players have to injuries by limiting the number of plays that they're playing. It makes a lot of sense, but again, it has its drawbacks. So they want to treat incomplete passes the same as running out of bounds. So if you're not familiar, when you run out of bounds at a certain point, as long as it's not within like 2 minutes of the quarter ending or the half ending, if you run out of bounds, the clock stops until they can reestablish the ball, until they can spot the ball, and then the clock starts back. Right now, under an incomplete pass, the clock stops as soon as the incomplete pass goes out of bounds or goes wherever, and it just stays stopped until the ball is snapped again. And of course, that would be an interesting decision. We'll get into some of the analysis here in a second. And then also they want to stopping the clock after first down. So that's something that we see a lot in the NFL right now. Well, see it all the time in the NFL right now, where if you get a first down and you stay in bounds, the clock continues to roll. Now, for many of us who love college football, we know that if our team gets a first down and they stay in bounds, well, it doesn't really matter, stay in bounds or goes out of bounds, the clock's going to stop. And if you stay in bounds, then the clock will restart after once the referee spots the ball. And typically they're pretty good about spotting the ball, but sometimes they're not so great. I think of, for example, if you recall the Dak Prescott situation in the playoff this year against, who did they play? The San Francisco 49ers, where they got a first down and he was running up there and the referee had to spot the ball and they didn't have enough time. And he didn't have enough time to spike the ball. If rules had been a little bit different, maybe things have played out differently, but that's how the NFL works. So again, the changes, they're aimed to help protect the players, right? And that's something we've seen repeatedly. Think of the fair catch rule on kickoffs now, where a guy can call for a fair catch within his own 20 or 25 yard line, and it doesn't matter where he is, as long as he calls for a fair catch and he catches the ball, then that protects him, and then the play's over, and they just take the ball wherever it would have been as far as a kickoff would be, right? And that's something we've seen throughout the years. They're trying to protect these players. They want to do whatever they can to protect these young men. And it's commendable, but, again, it has its drawbacks. I think of pass-heavy offenses, right? Think of your Wake Forests or your Ole Miss or even your Mississippi State, Ohio State, Alabama's. They tend to have longer games, right? And that makes a lot of sense because not only are they scoring a lot of points, right? And whenever you score, then you go to commercial breaks because you have all these certain moments where you have to go to commercial and you have all these stoppages and so on. But then also an incomplete pass stops the clock. And so these teams that score a lot of points and that are pass heavy and that are high flying tend to have longer games because they're ramming a number of plays in a short amount of time, right? You think of Auburn back in the mid 2010s or so with Gus Malzahn. They just ran and ran and ran and ran. Even when they were running the ball, they were going so incredibly quick, and they were running a number of plays on those defenses. And then you were worried about the fatigue on the defensive side of the ball as well. So the ultimate goal here, and I think the ultimate impact would be to lessen the amount of time those high-flying pass-first offenses are on the field. Because now if Bryce Young throws an incomplete pass under this rule, the clock continues to roll, right? Which won't continue to roll, but it'll restart after they spot the ball, which that's, well, I don't really know that I care a whole lot one way or another. It's going to see the number of plays slashed substantially, I feel like. And to some way, it's gonna really limit the advantage that these teams have established, right? You think of Lane Kiffin right now. If he gets a first down, or if he's in a situation where he can take advantage of your team, or take advantage of the opposition by just continuing to run a lot of plays and not giving the defense too much time to think, well, now your opportunity to really fatigue that defense is limited if you continue to have your plays cut back. Understandably so, right? So that'll have an impact. I don't necessarily know how much of an impact, but the second one really bothers me a lot, actually. Before I get into why, I want to make a clarification because, for a while, I've talked about things that separate college football from the NFL, right? I talked about how name, image, and likeness separated college from the NFL in the sense of players didn't get paid before last July or so, did not get paid. And as a result, supposedly did not get paid. Whether we get into the semantics or whether they were doing it under the table and so on, not my conversation to have. But supposedly we're not getting paid. Whereas you have these guys in the NFL who, they put out so much effort every single game when they have to because they want to impress other teams, when they want to impress the GM or the owner because they're in a contract year where they want to sign a multi-year deal and have stability throughout their late 20s, their 30s, and maybe even in some cases their 40s, right? You don't see that, or you haven't seen that for a while in college football until most recently, where name, image, and likeness took place, and then all of a sudden these guys are getting paid for their popularity and for what they can do for these brands. Now, I know it's not the same, and I know ultimately speaking, it's not going to really move the needle a whole lot when it comes to how these guys perform. Ultimately, we didn't see it happen a whole lot this year where Bryce Young, CJ Stroud, they still did incredible things, and other guys just kind of fell to the wayside. Sam Howell, DJ Uiagalelei, and I think even Max Johnson, or the backup at LSU, one of the two of them. They were always in a situation where they got a contract and it didn't quite work out because they didn't play too much. But regardless, name, image, and likeness, it was something that kind of struck me as like, oh, well, we're becoming a little bit more like the NFL, right? And there are other rules in place that I've always felt protected the integrity of college football. And this one in particular was one of them. As fans, we're used to certain things. And I've become used to when my team gets a first down, the clock stops temporarily, but it stops, right? It stops for longer if you go out of bounds or whatever else. But if you get a first down, the clock will stop. And we've become accustomed to that as college football fans, as we should. And when you change a rule like this, it kind of goes against the spirit of college football, in my opinion. This essentially turns us even closer to the NFL. For so long, I preferred college, like I mentioned, because of how much it differs from the NFL. And this gets us one step closer to being an NFL product. And, some rules help us continue to keep the products separate. And this one right here is what I think could continue to move that needle in the direction of your professional environment, right? I think it's important that we do whatever we can to keep our players amateurs as best we can. And hopefully keeping rules like this will do so. So why do I feel like it's so important? Well, I think changing this rule drastically changes how you handle late game situations, right? Some of our best moments throughout history have come as a result of this rule. And also, I think relatively inexperienced coaches and players, they need this rule. You don't really need it so much in the NFL because generally speaking, these guys know what to do. They've been playing football for 20 years in some cases. They know what to do. they know when they need to be and where they need to be and how they need to do it, right? Unless there's a new rule, in which case they'll handle it. But normally speaking, these guys know what to do. And in fact, sometimes these coaches take advantage of the rules that they've been given. You think of Mike Vrabel, he often will take advantage of a rule book situation, loophole kind of thing, and obviously he gets caught on it and so on. But these coaches are very smart at the NFL level. Not to say that these players aren't smart at the college level, but they're inexperienced. They haven't dealt with these situations. So it's very important that we do whatever we can to protect them and also give them the opportunity to grow. So like I mentioned, a number of our greatest moments have come because of this rule. First one I think of, Alabama, Georgia, 2012 in the SEC championship game. Now we know how it all unfolds, where Alabama takes the lead late with about 4 minutes to go with an A.J. McCarron pass to Amari Cooper over the top. They take the lead 32-28, I believe. And Georgia gets the ball with about a minute to go. Aaron Murray's driving down the field, and they keep getting first downs, and the clock continues to stop, right? And then there's one particular moment with about 12 seconds or so to go where they get a first down inside the 10-yard line, I believe. And Mark Richt doesn't spike the ball. We've talked about this before. I'm not going to go through it because Georgia fans have already suffered enough. But he doesn't spike the ball, and the clock stops as they're running to the line of scrimmage because they have to spot the ball. Once they spot the ball, Aaron Murray snaps the ball. He throws a pass. It's tapped by C.J. Mosley, falls into the hands of Chris Conley. He falls to the ground. Game over. Now, if the clock had not stopped in that moment or throughout that drive when they got first downs and stayed in bounds, perhaps they would not have even had the chance to get close to that close to the end zone, right? Other moments, LSU, Florida, 2020. We are familiar. That's the game where the young man, I forget his name, but the young man threw the shoe, right, and ended up giving LSU a chance to really put themselves in position to win that game. Ultimately, they did win that game. There were numerous plays late in that game where they needed the time, and the only reason they had the time was because they got first downs in bounds and the clock stopped. And then if they needed to spike the ball or whatever else, they could do it because the clock had stopped. Also, Ole Miss and Arkansas in 2021, we saw it just a few months ago. Final score, I believe, was 53-52. And if you recall, Arkansas scored a touchdown with 0 seconds left on the clock to make it a 1-point game. Then they went for 2, missed it. But again, the only reason they were in position to even score in that situation was because they had the opportunity to have the clock stop after they got a first down in bounds. And it's important to think about how some of the most incredible moments we've had throughout college football history, have come as a result of this rule. And again, we can try taking away, but look at what happened with the Cowboys just a few months ago, where they had a shot to maybe put themselves in position to win the game, but instead they ran out of time, right? And we've seen it unfold in the NFL. And honestly, I know that either of us, that you as a fan or that I as a fan, would want to see that happen to our team. And honestly, I kind of prefer the way it is because it gives us a little bit of a comfort zone, if you will, or a safety blanket, knowing that these young players, these inexperienced players, and these coaches who can't do a whole lot from the sideline sometimes with these young players, have the ability to stop the clock if you get a first down. And if we continue to look at changing rules like this, it only further takes away the integrity of the college football product. And I'm sure, like myself, you want to see the product that we have on a weekly basis continue to be the best it can be. And in my opinion, the only way that we do that is by keeping the clock rules for as long as we can the way that they are. We'll see how it unfolds. On to story number 3. So story number 3, we saw a wild race in Las Vegas this past Sunday between a number of drivers who almost had the shot to win it. Earlier in the week, on last Wednesday, a week ago, I said that Kyle Busch would win the race. I said, Kyle Busch, he's a Las Vegas native. He'll go out there and he'll win the race. And then a day later, 2 days later, he wrecks in practice. I was to go to a backup car, and I was like, well, I am officially a jinx, and I'm not picking Chase Elliott the rest of the year because I want him to win. And I obviously am cursing these players by picking them here on the show. And then, of course, Kyle Busch goes out there on Sunday and almost wins the race, coming from the back, and he almost pulls it off. And he was not all that happy when Alex Bowman pulled off the win at the end and outraced Kyle Larson. And, of course, Alex Bowman, he didn't necessarily have the best practice, didn't necessarily have the best qualifying, didn't necessarily have the best race, but he ended up in the right position at the right time as his pit crew put him in the right position at the right time, and then he just outraced Kyle Larson at the end. Kudos to Alex Bowman. He's now officially in the playoffs, and he's in good shape moving forward. Now, Kyle Busch was not exactly all that congratulatory of Alex Bowman, like I was, and like so many other were. He dropped an expletive laced rant toward the end of the race on Sunday, and I'm not going to quote it, but suffice to say, he was displeased. And he talked about how Alex Bowman continues to back into these wins because background, there's a stat out there saying that Alex Bowman, I think he's got 6 wins in the last 2 years. Most of those wins, he's led less than 25 laps, if I remember correctly. There's only one race where he led more than 60 laps, and I believe that was Dover last year. But for the most part, he's winning these races not necessarily by chance, but just because he's in the right position at the right time. The only reason he won the race this past Sunday was because his team decided to go with 2 tires instead of 4 tires when everybody else from 4th place back took 4 tires. And then, of course, the front 3 drivers, William Byron, Kyle Larson, and Alex Bowman, all took 2 tires. And then Alex Bowman just so happened to beat William Byron to the line. So then all of a sudden he is on the front line right next to Kyle Larson, which, keep in mind, Kyle Larson is probably the best racer in NASCAR right now. And he beats him off the line, beats him going around 2 laps around that track and wins the race. So did he get lucky by the fact there was a flag when Kyle Busch was easily leading with about 6 laps to go? Yeah, but again, when life gives you lemons, you got to make lemonade. And somehow Alex Bowman continues to make lemonade. Now, what were some key takeaways that I had about this race? Well, first off, pole position does not matter in NASCAR anymore. These cars have made it so that your pole position, how you qualify, does not really matter so much anymore. Let me just go back through a couple different races here. Daytona, you recall who started out first in the qualifying? Kyle Larson. He started Daytona first. He finished 32nd. Austin Cindric, he of course won the race. He started out 5th. So he was close, but it doesn't really matter in the end. He ended up winning the race regardless of where he started the race. Fontana, just about 10 days ago, right? Austin Cindric, who won the race in Daytona, he started first, and then he finished 12th. Whereas Kyle Larson, he technically qualified 13th, but you recall that he started in the back and had to race his way up to the front before he ended up winning the race in Fontana. And lastly, Las Vegas, this past Sunday, Christopher Bell, he started out first. He finished, I believe, 10th or so. Whereas, of course, Alex Bowman, he started the race 13th and finished first. Now, there was also a point late in the race where a graphic came up and it said that there was only one car in the top 10 at that point in time that started the race in the top 10, and that was Ricky Stenhouse Jr. And so it speaks to how things have changed over time. Because last year, if you recall, if you had a strong qualifying and you got the pole spot, you started out first, then you probably also had the best pit box choice, right? And then also in that case, you're probably going to end up winning the race. The number of times last year that Kyle Larson won qualifying, he started out first, he had the best pit box out there, and then ultimately ended up winning the race, happened far too many times. And it wasn't just Kyle Larson. There were a couple other situations, but for the most part, Kyle Larson and whoever else had that pole spot was usually in good position to win that race. That is not the case this year. And of course, it could change. We've only been 3 races in, but it seems like that is a theme that, unlike years past and unlike last year, how you qualify and whether or not you have that pole position doesn't really matter so much anymore. Now, other things that I took away from this race, tires, I talked about it last week that the tires were atrocious. That was the reason that a number of drivers just could not finish the race because their cars stalled out. Or if they did finish the race, they were multiple laps down because they had to get towed back to the pit box, and then they lost every single lap that the leaders drove past them. And ultimately, that was not as much of an issue this week. We did not lose nearly as many drivers to tire issues this time around. I don't know if that's because they fixed the tires. I don't know if that's something that they did on Goodyear's end. I don't know what that is, but I think it's something to continue to watch because, like I mentioned, that tire issue is something that could destroy your day. And it seems like they've addressed it, hopefully, right? It's nice to see that not as many cars are stalling out on the track. And as long as we have less cars continue to stall on the track and losing laps, and I mean, think about like a short track like Richmond, you're going to lose laps pretty quickly. Or Martinsville, you're going to lose laps pretty quickly if you have to get towed back to your pit box. So great to see that tires are not as much of an issue now, but we'll see how that unfolds over the next few weeks. On to next week, though, we've got a big race in Phoenix. Of course, Phoenix is where we have our championship, I think in November or so. And we are back. We just saw, I believe Kyle Larson won there back in November to win the championship. Now let's talk about who I think could pull it off this time around. So since February 2019, you've got Kyle Larson. He's got 3 top 5 finishes and 5 starts, whereas Kevin Harvick, he's got an average finish of 6th and 6 starts. And Ryan Blaney, he has 3 top 5s in 6 starts as well. So if I had to tell you my top 3 guys that could win this week, I would go Larson, Harvick, or Blaney. But if I had to narrow it down to one, I went back through all the history books. I said, okay, who is really good at Phoenix and who knows that track unlike anyone else? Well, Kevin Harvick. Kevin Harvick, he's won there 9 times. And of course, like I mentioned, he's won his average finish over the last 6 starts is 6th. So he knows how to get up to the front. And if he doesn't win, he'll be right up toward the front to put himself in position to win potentially. So I'll take Kevin Harvick to go from 9 wins and take that to 10 wins this week in Phoenix. The first win of the season for Stewart-Haas Racing. Now we've seen 2 Hendrick cars win and we've seen 1 Penske car win. So we'll see who breaks the trend a little bit this week as well. Now, like I said, we've got a lot of great stuff coming up over the next few days and next few weeks. We are only a few days away from the NCAA tournament. And like I said, get ready because we'll be going through my entire bracket, not necessarily the entire thing, but I'll be giving you my highlights as far as who I expect to come out of what regions and so on. And a number of other things are happening outside of the college basketball world as well. So just get ready because little did I know, I did not expect this to happen. But March and April and the months ahead are going to be jam-packed of headlines that'll keep us busy for quite some time. So as always, I appreciate you joining us. If you want to hear more, check us out on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Radio Public, Breaker, or YouTube at BWI Productions. And once again, thank you again for allowing us the opportunity to talk some ball with you.